We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Vav Amud Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 96a. The Gemara is discussing the fact that by the exemption of Ba'ol of Imo, let's say you have a shoel or a socher, and the owner of the item is working with the shoel or the socher, so then we say there's an exemption, and the shoel and the socher are not going to be responsible. Let's say something happens that they are normally responsible for. And so the Gemara is discussing the source from the Psukim, and the Gemara now says, Rava Savar Lo Rabbi Yonasan and Mitaretz L'Kroi Rabbi Yonasan. Rava in general holds like Rabbi Yonasan. We'll see Rashi in a moment, and he will explain the Psukim according to Rabbi Yonasan to derive the fact that this Patur, this exemption of Ba'al of Imo, applies specifically when the Ba'al of Imo, when the owner is with the shoel or socher at the time of the actual borrowing. Rashi explains, Rava Savar like Rabbi Yonasan, Rava holds like Rabbi Yonasan, Damar Echad Mashma. Rabbi Yonasan holds that in general, if you have two things in a list, we assume that it's either or. We essentially assume a separation. And over here also, you have various times where the owner could be working together with the shoel. It could be the time of the borrowing, for example, and it could be the time of the onus, the time that the accident happens. And we're going to say again that it's only the time of the actual borrowing that counts. Umitaretz drasha dekroik Rabbi Yonasan. So he explains the psukim like Rabbi Yonasan, Lemidrash Kihani Masnisin Dil'el, in order to explain what we said earlier. And so the Gemara explains the Tanya as we learned in a Braisa, in Ba'al of Imo Lo Yeshalim, again it says, in Ba'al of Imo Lo Yeshalim, we'll note over here that the Bach takes out the word the Tanya. This is not a Braisa, but just an explanation of the Pasuk. So again, the Pasuk says, in Ba'al of Imo Lo Yeshalim, it says if the owner is with him, then you don't pay. That's the Pasuk of the exemption. Mashma di'ise betarvayu, umashma nami, techi'ise bechada v'lesa bechada pater. That sounds like whether the owner is with him throughout the entire time, or even if the owner is just there by one of the time periods, meaning either the time of the borrowing or the time of the onus, that sounds like your pater. But then on the other hand, there's the pasuk that says the opposite, that if the owner is not with him, then he does have to pay. That sounds like he's not throughout the whole time with him. It also sounds like, again, with the separation, even if he's only there at one time period, he's going to have to pay. So clearly, again, there's one time period which is critical over here, which is an exemption, and the other time period is not an exemption. Lomar lach, it's to say to you, Haya imo b'shas she'ela, if the owner is working with him at the time of the borrowing, ein sarach lios imo b'shas shvura umesa, he does not need to be with him at the time that the animal gets injured or dies. Haya imo b'shas shvura umesa, if he's with him, working with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies, tzarech lios imo b'shas she'ela. Again, the requirement is, in order to get the exemption, that he's working with him at the time of the borrowing. And the Gemara continues, Eipachana, but even if we're going to say these drashas, whether we're following Rabbi Yonasan or Rabbi Yoshia, why not reverse it? Why are we so certain that it's the Shas She'ela that is the critical time for the exemption? And the Gemara says, Mistabra She'ela Adif. It makes sense to say that the time of the borrowing, that is the preferred time in terms of the exemption, Mishum de Kamaisi Lol Reshuse, because that's the time that the person, the shoel, the borrower, is bringing it into his Reshus. The Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, Shvura Umesa Adifa, maybe we should prefer the time of injury or the time of death. Shekain Chaye Ba'onse, that's the moment of obligation when the onus happens. And the Gemara says to that, Ilo She'ela Shvura Umesa Mayavid, if not for the borrowing, what difference would it make, the injury or the death? But the Gemara says, on the contrary, if he laughs Shvura Umesa, if not for the injury or the fact that the animal died, She'ela Mayavid, what difference does it make that there was a borrowing? And the Gemara says, Afilu Hachi, nevertheless, She'ela Adifa, She'ela, the moment of borrowing, that is the preferred time to say there's an exemption. Shekain chayev b'mezonose, because the person is obligated through the borrowing, the person is obligated to feed this animal. And Rashi explains, maybe I should reverse it. We should say the moment when it gets injured is the time, where if the owner is working with him, there's an exemption. That's the moment where you're chayiv on the onus. But then the Gemara said, no, it's the moment of borrowing, where you're chayiv in the mezonos al yadeh. Through that, meaning through the borrowing, he's chayiv to provide mezonos for the animal. And the Gemara continues, Ravashi says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, V'chi yishal ish me'im re'eyu. It says a person borrows from his friend, v'lo re'ehu imo. We actually darshan that the friend can't be with him, the friend can't be working for him. Shalim yishalim, that's the time that he pays. Hare'ehu imo. But if his friend is with him, and specifically it's at the time of the borrowing, because the pasuk is talking about the moment of the borrowing. V'chi yishal ish me'im re'ehu is talking about when he borrows from his friend. If at that point in time the friend is with him, pater, then he is exempt. So Rav Ashi essentially is bringing a different source for this concept of ba'al of imo, this exemption when the owner is with him. And this source that Rav Ashi is bringing says clearly that the moment of borrowing is the critical moment in time when the owner has to be with the borrower. But the Gemara says, well, ihachi, if so, if Rav Ashi has a totally different source, ba'alav einimo ve'im ba'alav imo lamali, what do we even need the psukim of ba'alav einimo and ba'alav imo? Why do we need these psukim of ba'alav imo if we learn it out from v'chayish alish me'im re'eyu? And so the Gemara says to that, Ilav Hanach, if not for those psukim, Hava Amina Hai Urche Dekrohu. I would have just said that you're not supposed to learn anything from this pasuk of V'chayish Alish Me'im Re'eu. That's just the way the pasuk speaks about borrowing. It's not meant to teach you anything about Ba'al Avimo. Once we have the psukim about Ba'al Avimo, now we know that is a concept of exemption. We then apply that to this pasuk of V'chayish Alish Me'im Re'ehu. And Rashi explains, Rav Ashi Amar Mikra Gufe Mashma Dashas She'ela Kapid. From the pasuk itself, it sounds like it's the moment of borrowing that's important. To Me'im Re'ehu Mashma Lo Re'ehu Asmo Nishalo, because that's what Me'im Re'ehu implies. The Alom Masakra Shalim Yishalim, and that's when the person has to pay. Al Mashas She'ela Kapedaka. You see that it's the moment of borrowing that is the key. Only at that moment, if the Re'ehu is Imo, if the person who lent it to him is with him, is working with him, then you have the exemption. But the Gemara still said you still need the psukim of Ba'al Avimo, Ilav Hanach Dehadaru Parish Mil Setvei. If not for those psukim which essentially explain, they elaborate, Lo Havim Matzino Lamelef Mim Re'ehu V'lo Re'ehu Atzmo. We would never have darshaned Me'im Re'ehu means V'lo Re'ehu Atzmo Dikol Meimar Orche Dekra Lemishtoi Hachi. That's just the way maybe the pasuk speaks. V'lo Shna B'Bailim V'lo Shna Below Bailim. It doesn't matter if the owner is working with him. Chayev is Chayev. V'hashda Degali Seifa De B'Bailim Potter. But once we know now from the end of the psukim that there's this exemption when he's working with the Bailim, it's going on one of the moments in time. Potter, on one of the moments of time, there's an exemption. And in the other moment, then we learn from this pasuk that it's the moment of the borrowing that is critical in terms of the exemption. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rami Bar Chama asks the following question. Shalo l'riva ma'u, if a person borrows an animal, but he borrows the animal in order to engage in bestiality with the animal, so then the question over here is that considered regular borrowing and the person is chayiv in onsin, is chayiv in accidents? Kedeshayli inshi bo'inan, do we need the person to borrow it for a normal reason? Well, hachi lo shayli inshi, generally people don't borrow animals for this purpose. Odilmar maybe time ma'imi shum hana, the reason is because you're getting a certain benefit from the animal. V'ainami islei hana, this person also is getting a benefit from the animal, and therefore he's responsible for accidents. Similarly, shala le rose, but what if a person is borrowing an animal, he just wants to look wealthy? If he looks wealthy, then people are going to do business with him. That's why he's borrowing it. Mao, so what's the halacha there? Again, is he responsible for accidents? Mamona ba'inan va'ika. On the one hand, you could say it's a money issue which you do have over here, and so therefore he's responsible. Odilmar, maybe mamona de islay hana minei ba'inan. Maybe it has to be that he's borrowing something that has monetary value and he's deriving benefit. V'lek, and you have no benefit being derived over here. You're not benefiting specifically or directly from the animal, so maybe he's not responsible for accidents. Shalo lasos bapachos mi pruta ma. What if a person is borrowing it in order to do work, but that work does not even equal a pruta? Mamona ba'inan ve'ika, so you just need to have money, which you do have. Odilmar, maybe kol pachos mi pruta lo klumi, anything less than a pruta is not worth anything, and that would not count. Shoal shtei paros, what if a person borrows 2 cows, lasos behen pruta, but only to do the work that's valued at a pruta? Mahu, what would be the halach over there? Miamrin and zil basar shoel umashil v'ika. On the one hand, you could say, we follow the borrower and the lender, and you have here a borrowing of a pruta. Odilmar, maybe zil basar paros, you have to look at each cow, v'chol chada v'chada lekamamon, and each one does not have a value of real monetary value, because each one, if you divide it out, is not a pruta. Shal mishutvin v'nishal lo echad mehen. What if a person borrows from partners and then only one of the partners is doing work with him? Ma'u, what's the halacha? Do you have the exemption of ba'al of imo? Kulo ba'al of ba'inan v'haleka. Maybe you need all of the owners to be working with him, which you don't have. Odilma me'ahu palga didei mi'amifter. Maybe from that half there is the exemption. And the other side of the question, shutvin shashalu v'nishal echad mehen ma. What if you have partners who are borrowing and then the owner is offering his services to just one of the partners? What's the halacha? Kulo shoel ba'inan v'haleka. Maybe he needs to work with all of the borrowers. Odilmar, maybe ba'hi palga deshaili mios mifter. Maybe on that half, in terms of that borrower, maybe then we would say that there is that exemption. Shoal meho isha v'nishal bala. Let's say a person borrows from a woman who's a married woman, and then the husband is doing work. Is that going to create the exemption? Or isha shashala v'nishal libal. Or let's say you have a woman and she's borrowing, but then the work is being done for the husband. So what's the halach over there? Kinyan peiros ke kinyan guf dami. So there we're dealing really with a kinyan peiros. Talking there about nichsei melug, we'll see Rashi in a moment, but is that considered the same as a regular kinyan? Or lower, do we say no, that's not considered the same as a regular kinyan? And Rashi explains, Shol min ha'isha parash al nichsei melug, if a person borrows from the wife a cow which is nichsei melug, v'nisha lo bala, and then her husband is the one that's working for the borrower, l'malachto, he's offering his services to the borrower, or isha shashal, or the other way around, the wife is borrowing lachrosh karka melug, to use it to plow the karka, the land which is melug, v'nishalu habaylim l'bal l'melechasatzmo, and the person that she's borrowing from, so he's offering services to her husband. So there the question revolves around whether kinyan peiros is kinyan aguf. Kinyan peiros shahabal ochel peiros malug. The fact is that the husband, he gets the fruits of the nichsei malug which the wife brings into the marriage. Is that kinyan haguf dami? Is that the same thing as owning the property itself? V'havalei bailim shol v'nishal kilo karko parshalo. So then it's like you have a real case here of ba'ol avimo, because the husband is considered the owner of the property just like the wife. Again, that question depends on whether we hold kinyan peiros is kinyan haguf dami or not. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravina le Ravashi, Ravina said to Ravashi, Omer l'shlucha, if somebody says to his agent, Tzei v'hashali in porasi, I'm going to lend out my cow and I want you to be my agent and you're going to be the one that offers services instead of me. Mahu, what's the halacha there? Ba'ol of mamish ba'ina, do we need the actual owner of the cow to offer his services? V'leka, and that you don't have over here, so you would not have the exemption of Ba'ol of imo. O dilma, or maybe shlucha shaladam kamosa, we say that the agent of a person is like the person himself, v'ika, and so therefore you do have the exemption of Ba'al Avimo. Amar le Ravacha breder Ravavi le Ravashi. Ravacha, the son of Ravavi, said to Ravashi, Baal, when it comes to the husband, with the question we asked above, whether kinyan peiros is kinyan aguf, pluksad Reb Yochanan v'Reish Lakish. The answer to that question is it's actually a machlokas Reb Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and shliach, and when it comes to an agent offering services together with the cow that's being lent, pluksad Reb Yonasan v'Reb Yoshia, that's a machlokas between Reb Yonasan and Reb Yoshia. And the Gemara explains, Baal pluksad Reb Yochanan v'Reish Lakish, by the husband, in terms of nichsei melug, that's a machlokas Reb Yochanan and Reish Lakish as follows. The itmar, because it was stated, Hamocher sadeu lechaveru lepeiros, if somebody sells his field to his friend, meaning to say that the friend is not going to own the field, but is just going to get the peiros, the fruits from the field. Rabbi Yochanan says, in terms of the obligation of bikurim, mevi vikore, he brings the bikurim and he reads the parsha as if he is the owner, because Rabbi Yochanan holds that kinyan peiros is kinyan aguf. Reish Lakish says, maybe he does bring bikurim, ve'eno kori, but he doesn't read the parsha because he's not really the owner of the property. And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Yochanan Omer Mevi V'Kori Kinyan Peiros Kinyan Aguf Dami. Rabbi Yochanan says he brings the Bikurim and reads from the Parsha, because the owning the fruits is the same as owning the property. He can say it's really my property and read from that Parsha in the Torah. Reish Lakish Omer Mevi Ve'eno Kori, but Reish Lakish says no. He brings the Bikurim, but he doesn't read from the Parsha. Kinyan Peiros Lav Kinyan Aguf Dami, because the ownership of the fruits is not the same as owning the property itself. And Rashi explains, Hamocher Sadeu Lepeiros, somebody sells his field for the produce. The idea is that the buyer eats the produce for 2 or 3 years, and then he returns the property to the original owner. So maybe bikurim, he brings the bikurim, which are the first fruits. V'korei arami ovidavi, he reads from the parsha of arami ovidavi. V'chol parshi, he reads that whole section. V'korei ani bo hine hevesias reishis priha adama asher nasat li. He can read that pasuk which says this is from the land that was given to me. If you're reading from that parsha, it means the kinyan peiros kinyan aguf. The fact that he owns the produce is like he owns the land itself. And the Gemara continues, shliach. Now, when it comes to an agent, that's the case where the agent is offering services instead of the actual person lending the cow. So that's pluksa de Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshia. That's a machlokas Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshia. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Omer la petropis, if a person says to a caretaker, kolin nedorim shtei ishti noderes mikan ad she'ovu mimakom ploni, all of the vows that my wife takes from this point in time until I return, hefer lo, you should annul those vows. He's essentially appointing an agent to annul the vows of his wife. And then he does that, he annuls these vows for her. Yachol yumufar, and I might think that that's considered to be a good annulment. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, Isha yakimenu v'isha yafeirenu. It's the husband who upholds or who annuls the vows. Divrei Rabbi Yoshia, that's Rabbi Yoshia's opinion. Rabbi Yonasan Omer, Rabbi Yonasan says, Matzinu b'chol makom sheshlucho shaladam kamo. So we find everywhere that a person's agent is like the person himself, and therefore the agent is effective. And so the same thing is going to be true by the exemption of Ba'al Avimo. Rabbi Yonasan is going to say, shlucho shaladam kamo. So Rashi says, La Petropis, talking about a caretaker, hayaholech lemedinas hayam. The case over here is, let's say a person is traveling far away, umina apetrop al nechasav lazon ishto ovanov. He appoints somebody to take care of his property, and that person is going to provide mizonos, he's going to provide food for the person's wife and children. So again, you're essentially designating that person as an agent in terms of annulment of vows, and that's a machlokas Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonasan. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravilish le Rava. Ravilish said to Rava, Omer la'avdot seva hashalim parasi. What if a person says to a slave, go and offer services together with the cow that I am lending? Mahu, what would be the halacha in that case? So it's similar to a case of essentially sending an agent, but the Gemara says, Tiboy laman damar shlucho shaladim kamoso. This could be a question according to the one who says shlucho shaladim kamoso. And Tiboy laman damar shlucho shaladim eno kamoso. It's also a question if you say that a shliach of a person is not like himself. Tiboy laman damar shlucho shaladim kamoso. It's a question according to the one who says that the agent of a person is like the person himself. Hani mili shliach de bar mitzvah. That's true of a shliach who's part of doing mitzvahs. Aval eved de lav bar mitzvah, but an eved who does not do mitzvahs, lo, so no, maybe we would not apply agency in that case. O dilmer, maybe afil laman damar ein shlucho shaladim kamoso. Maybe the other direction. Even according to the one who says that we don't say shlucho shaladim kamoso, hani mili shliach. Maybe that's only true by a shliach. Aval eved, but by a slave, yad eved kiyad rabo damya. Maybe we say that the hand of the slave is like an extension of the hand of the master. Amar le, he said back to him, Mistabra, makes sense to say, Yad Eved ki Yad Rabo Damya, that the hand of the slave is like the hand of the master. And Rashi explains, Eved delav bar mitzvah lo, and Eved doesn't do mitzvah, so shlichus nafgalon me'atem gam atem l'rabo shluchachem. We learn out shlichus from the pasuk of gam atem, which includes your shliach, the bu'inon dumya de mishalech, which means that the shliach has to be similar to the one sending him. Sheyudinav no hagim bo, that the same laws that apply to the mishalech apply to the shliach. V'zeh indin shoel no hegbo. Here you don't have the laws of shoel that apply to him. V'gam mashal she'in lo klum below rabbi. You don't have the laws of shoel and mashal, because he doesn't have anything. He doesn't own anything without his master, and therefore, since he's not similar to the master in that regard, maybe we don't say shlucho shaladim kamosa when it comes to an eved. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rami Bar Chama asks the following question, Baal b'nichsei ishto, when it comes to a husband with regards to the property of his wife, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Vav Amid Beis.